Again, welcome to everybody signing on. I'm just going to give it another few seconds here so folks can get into the room before we get started. All right, greetings, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you may be. We're glad to have you here today to discuss the role of AI in the 2024 elections. I'm Danielle Allen, and I'm the James Bryant Conant University professor here at Harvard University. I direct the Allen Lab for Democracy Renovation at the Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation at Harvard's Kennedy School. I also direct the Democratic Knowledge Project at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And I will start with a few announcements on behalf of the Ash Center. The Ash Center acknowledges the land on which Harvard sits is the traditional territory of the Massachusetts people. We also recognize the continuing presence of the neighboring Wampanoag and Nipmuc nations. Today's discussion is being recorded. You'll receive a link to that recording in an email following the conclusion of the event. You will also be able to find it on the Ash Center's YouTube channel. We're going to reserve the last 30 minutes of this hour-long webinar to respond to audience questions. So please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen at any time. In other words, you don't need to wait till we get to Q&A to start putting your questions into the Q&A feed. We'll be glad to have them coming in all the way through the conversation. So anytime something strikes you as confusing or provokes your curiosity and your further thinking, please put that in the Q&A and we will be very delighted to build a conversation from what you're thinking about. I'm really pleased to have two wonderful colleagues here with me today. Bruce Schneier is an internationally renowned security technologist. He's been called a security guru by The Economist. He is the New York Times best-selling author of 14 books, including A Hacker's Mind, and also of hundreds of articles, essays, and academic papers. Bruce is a fellow at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society here at Harvard, and a lecturer in public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. We are also joined by Nate Persily. Nate's the James B. McClatchy Professor of Law at Stanford Law School. He's the founding co-director of the Stanford Cyber Policy Center and the Stanford MIT Healthy Elections Project. Professor Persily's scholarship and legal practice address issues such as voting rights, political parties, campaign finance, redistricting, and election administration. These are all topics covered in his co-authored election law casebook, The Law of Democracy. And his current work examines the impact of social media and artificial intelligence on political communication, campaigns, and elections. So Bruce and Nate, I'm really glad to have you back again. We had a fun time in the spring on a webinar where we were looking forward. We were anticipating this incredible year of elections around the globe, and we were wondering about the kind of impact AI might have on what transpired. We definitely put out some ideas for how to keep the electoral system sound. We talked about the importance of supporting people in identifying trusted sources of information early, for example, Secretary of State's offices. We talked about strategies for guarding against deep fakes and what it would mean for us to develop a culture where we presumed that media was fictitious first and then looked for things to be verified and validated. We talked about education and building digital competence for the larger population. We had a lot of wonders, I think, about how much AI was going to impact the election, especially the US election. The fact that that election transpired in such a polarized context, I think, made it seem ripe for AI-driven kinds of interventions that might be problematic. Now, here we are with the election behind us and with many elections all over the world behind us. It's time to take stock and to see how things actually landed. I'm going to invite each of my guests to share a few opening remarks, and then I'll add some myself, and then we'll turn it into a conversation. And then, as I said, we'll come back to Q&A. So, Bruce, what would be your roundup of how the elections actually went and what the role of AI was in them?
I think there's been a lot of AI in the election, but not in the places that that made the news. So I'm actually writing a book on AI and democracy, and here is the draft, and I'm going to be looking through it to have full of examples. I'm not going to really talk about misinformation. I think that is the least interesting thing about AI and elections, and it seems like this year it wasn't much of a thing. I've been telling people that you think of the two biggest pieces of information in the last weeks of the election, which was Haitians eating pets and FEMA's out to get you. Both had nothing to do with AI, and we don't need AI for misinformation. And I think more interesting is how AI is permeating kind of every aspect of elections. So, talking to voters, we're seeing AI being used for different aspects of that. So, language translation. In India, Modi uses AI to translate his speeches in real time, something like 20 different languages. New York City, Mayor Eric Adams did the same thing, used AI real-time language translation. Uh, this year in Pakistan, there's a former prime minister that used an AI voice clone to deliver political speeches while he was in prison. So this ability to reach more voters through AI means is turning out to be surprisingly powerful. The weirdest surprise is a candidate for governor in Tokyo. His name is Takahiro Ano, and he's like a 33-year-old unknown. And he has this AI avatar. I think it's on Reddit. He answers over 8,000 questions from constituents, and he comes in fifth. Like he actually places it in a way that matters in an election he kind of had no business winning. And that is, again, through the use of AI. Other examples, we had presidential candidates with AI chatbots, didn't make much of a difference. So we're starting to see that AI being used in communication. Second thing is polling. And this is controversial when I say it, but polling is a lot more than asking people a question and then producing the results. There's a lot of math between the question asked and the results you see. And AI is now becoming part of that math, both in being able to figure out trends from the data, being able to simulate answers by voters, and being used to in social listening, getting data from different pieces of social media. A bunch of companies have sprung up to do this work. And it's sort of interesting to watch the difference between asking people who are like, they're hard to reach, they don't answer truthfully, but at least they're people, with asking an AI, which you can ask literally 10,000 questions to, but you worry that they are not exactly aligned with voters. So I think this is happening. There's going to be a lot more of that. More broadly, we're seeing AI being used in political organizing. So there's an app called Votivate. This is a Democratic Party and uses AI voice to call voters and tell them where their polling place is, but also used to produce campaign strategies about, and so tailoring videos to voters. We're seeing AI being used in get out the vote efforts, organizing how people are moving through a city, a geography, contacting individual voters and what to tell them. Right, the risks here are demagoguery, that telling each voter what they want to hear means telling different things to different voters. But these are the sorts of activities that humans are really good at. We don't have enough humans. There is an AI system, I forget the name of it, that is in the US to help people run for nonpartisan office. Fill out the forms, get a website, do the things necessary to run for office. That seems phenomenal. Fundraising, there are fundraising tools. I saw a study that the Democratic Party found that AI fundraising messages are more effective than human written ones. That means they're doing it. Right? That means they're using AI for fundraising. It's already being used to profile potential donors and how to approach them. Lastly, AI assisted strategy. We hear some noises about that where AI is being used to help hone political strategies. We're not seeing any real products yet, but I guarantee you that politicians are using this stuff. What is interesting to me about all these applications is that they require no changes in the law, no discussion among all of us whether it's a good idea. If a candidate wants to do it, they do it, period. So I think we're going to see more AI being used as an adjunct to human experts in all of these activities.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Bruce, for those opening thoughts. Nate, over to you for your debrief reflection.
Thank you. So, as I said in the spring, AI amplifies the abilities of all good and bad actors in the system to achieve the same goals that they've always had. And so I think Bruce laid out a good set of instances where contemporary campaign tools then are made better in some way through AI. And all the human work that would be going into some of these campaign strategies and tactics, AI may amplify them. I would add one thing on that, which is that it's going to be hard for us to like identify the AI component of, say, new developments in the campaign universe, because every digital tool essentially has some AI that's built into it at this point. And so whenever you're constructing, messaging or doing data analysis or any other kinds of things, let alone something that's more interactive with social media, there's some AI component to it. I don't think it's critical that we like figure out, a rule as to when some AI is too much AI, but I think that's important. Let me talk a little bit about the disinformation stuff since Bruce seeded that ground a little bit. Um, I think that the fear that people had coming into the election exceeded what was the reality, and I think that was predictable. But if you looked at polls that were at the beginning of the election season, a majority of Americans thought that AI might determine the outcome of the election. Now that's not terribly surprising, since the people are anxious about technology and they're anxious about the democracy, and you put the two together, and they've got kind of conjoined anxieties when it comes to tech and democracy. That's true for AI as it is for social media and everything else. Um, but those fears, I think, were not realized in this election. But that's not because there weren't millions of examples of deep fake or other kinds of synthetic media. There was an avalanche of this kind of media out there. But the key question is whether it actually affected people's behaviors and attitudes, and was it targeted to those people? Did people who were persuadable see this kind of disinformation? And we really didn't see much of that. Now, why didn't we see much of that? Um, First of all, for the platforms that cared about this and cared about disinformation, the same countermeasures that they had been using for other kinds of misleading content would apply here, which is not about the content itself. It's about the network of accounts that would propagate this kind of content. So it's not enough that you have some, synthetic media about Kamala Harris or Donald Trump. It's also about how you're going to be able to essentially beat the countermeasures that the platforms have in place, which themselves, by the way, are heavily infused with AI. So if you want to point out maybe the area where AI had the biggest impact in this election, it was defeating other AI. And so that's what the platforms often would do. And so I think that's, the platform countermeasures are part of it. The second is that a lot of the AI generated imagery that we saw was sort of satirical. As Bruce was saying, that the controversy in the last month dealing with what happened in northern Ohio, you actually saw all kinds of synthetic images of, say, Trump hugging ducks and cats and things like that. And that's the way a lot of these deep or cheap fakes are being used, right? It's not about misleading people, but it's about sort of piling on to narratives that are already there. And so these new tools allow you to construct those kinds of images, even if people are not going to think that they're real. Um, the other thing I would say is that we began to see some, both in the United States and around the world, we began to see some of what we call the liar's dividend paying out, which is that the more ubiquitous phenomenon was not that people were being misled by synthetic content, but that politicians were disclaiming true stuff as being AI generated. And so we saw that in Turkey, we saw that in a few other places in India. We saw it even in the United States, where Donald Trump tweeted or Truth Socialed saying that Kamala Harris had AI'd her crowd sizes in one of her trips. And so That I think is, in some ways, I've always felt the more dangerous trend when it comes from AI, which is that the small amount of synthetic media that infects people's perception of the mostly true media that they're otherwise consuming related to politics. Um, there was concern throughout the election season of misuse of existing AI tools for political information. So whether it was ChatGPT or Claude or other kinds of tools that people would go to them and try to find their polling place, and that would lead people astray. And there were some studies that sort of kicked the tires on these tools and found that they weren't as reliable as advertised. A lot of what both Anthropic and OpenAI did was to partner with other institutions, particularly with OpenAI, it was National Association of Secretaries of State, and Anthropic, it was Democracy Works, in order to kick some of these queries out to reliable sources. And so some of the most important things that the platforms did was to try to sort of steer people away from AI when they thought it might mislead them with respect to, say, election administration questions. That's going to be a persistent challenge for them as people increasingly turn to them as if they're Google search as opposed to, just text generators. The last thing I would say is maybe not really the topic of this discussion, but it is remarkable, isn't it, that in the United States, we are on the precipice of what could be the most major technological revolution in our lifetime, and it basically played no role in the campaign itself, right? So that we are about to see AI pop up in so many areas of social and political life, and yet when it came to political discussions this year related to policy, it was basically a non-issue. And so for all of the fright that is currently banding about what might happen in the next administration, in some ways, this may be the issue that that they have to deal with, and we really haven't been talking about it enough.
So interesting. Thank you so much. I'll just add a few more reflections, and then, as I said, I'll pull us over to the discussion. So when we gathered for our webinar in the spring, and we were thinking about these questions, in addition to the things I named, another theme we put on the table was that it might be the case that one element of responding to the impacts of AI on democracy and electoral systems would involve not fixes to technology or regulation of technology, but actually redesigns to the electoral institutions themselves, so they would provide people with different kinds of incentives for behavior. And I am always, for example, an advocate of ranked choice voting, because it means people have to be coalition builders. It gives them different incentives for how they're using media in the first place and pulls things in a more positive direction. It's interesting that there were actually a host of ballot initiatives around democracy redesign on the ballot in November. And one set won everywhere and another set lost in most places. And both of these, though, were really ballot initiatives that were oriented towards this issue of the integrity of the system. So one set were the ranked choice voting ballot initiatives that I just alluded to. A second set, as I don't know if you two noticed this, but was ballot initiatives to make it illegal in the US for non-citizens to vote in state and local elections. So it's been understood that non-citizens couldn't vote, but it hasn't been actually a formally matter of law. And so states have been closing that loophole, so to speak. But every single one of those ballot initiatives passed. So I think it is worth naming this, because the ranked choice voting ones, which again are a way of providing more integrity to the electoral system, largely didn't pass. These about non-citizen voting did pass. They were also about the integrity of the system. So I do think that they kind of collectively represented concerns abroad, in the land, so to speak, about whether or not our electoral mechanisms can withstand all of the kind of complexities around identity, around how voice is used in destabilizing ways and the like. But the things that succeeded as solutions here were really focused on the identity question, more so than on the voice and communications question. So I think that's sort of an interesting element of everything that unfolded. And again, that wasn't formally, AI policy or tech policy, but I think it was a kind of implicit, quiet way in which the country was engaging with the question of how we handle the impacts of technology. So With that also on the table, let me turn to some questions, and then I'll bring in questions from the Q&A as well. So first, I'm really interested in the fact that, we did see an increased volume of digital interference from foreign adversaries. We did see here and there in the US the sort of sporadic deepfake effort, Joe Biden's voice in New Hampshire, the Taylor Swift deepfake and the like. So there was synthetic media, but to your point, the point that you've both made, it really didn't have an impact. For the most part, nobody in the political landscape was taken in by any of these deep fakes. And then we had the sort of satirical synthetic media as another example. I'm wondering if you could reflect a little bit on this issue and the relationship between trust and technology. And what I'm wondering is sort of roughly this. We know these technologies are working, and Nate, you may have some thoughts on this in sort of one-to-one context, and that we are seeing a growth in fraud and scams and so forth. Yet people don't get taken in the political context. Is it perhaps the case that our polarization is actually already an inoculation, that our low levels of trust of politicians and political institutions are actually inoculating us in that context in a way that they're not when deep fakes are sort of moving along the channels of our personal relationships? Curious what you think about that.
So I could start. I think I have a different take. I think
Yeah.
most political information that's passed around on social media is not about truth, and it's not about convincing. It's my team good, your team bad. And the truth content doesn't matter. It's not actually relevant. I share it because it is social signaling. We're showing we have the same identity. And so that's really the way I see it, and why I don't think, but I don't think it has the same purpose as advertising or something else.
Mhm. Okay. And
I agree. I largely agree with that. Actually, I would. But let me expand on what you said, though, Danielle, which is that um, there's something about the public spaces in which AI generated content appears, and then there are private spaces where it appears, where the other kind of countermeasures, whether it's by platforms or whether it's the marketplace of ideas or whether it's the mainstream media checking it, will not be present. And so, as you said, the area where we're seeing the greatest harm. I mean, there's two areas of significant harm in the advent since ChatGPT that I would say. The first, as you were suggesting, is these one-on-one scams. So whether it's voice cloning or other kinds of deceptive emails that are well targeted to people, which we've seen for many generations at this point, but now they're even more persuasive, and especially if they're using, say, voice or images that are private and targeted, they could cause real harm. And so these are like calls where in the voice of someone's child, and then it leads someone to ask for kidnapping, ransom, and things like that. We saw something like that in Brazil. And so you can think about how that could be rolled out in politics so robocalls on steroids, but they're very personalized, and whether it's impersonating candidates or just trying to persuade people. So that's one area. The other area, which is not related to politics, but is about harm, is about the explosion in child pornography, virtual child pornography that we've seen as a result of the open source image models. And that again is about, it's about closed communities that then become repositories for this awful stuff. And we will never live in a world where there isn't an infinite amount of that kind of content. And that is going to be true for political content as well. That we just, when it comes to imagery, there's just going to be a lot of it. And so people, and this goes to your polarization point, people will retreat into their echo chambers, which is to say their trusted sources, as to whether they're going to think that some of that synthetic imagery is true or not. And we'll see some kinds of divergence. But as Bruce said, most of the time, truth is not relevant in the way a lot of people are consuming this kind of synthetic content and political advocacy. And that's why that kind of satirical content that we saw out of the Northern Ohio controversy is an example of that.
That's really helpful. I appreciate that. So then to that last point, I mean, that actually I think really brings up the question that you or the sort of theme that you raised of the ways in which the platform companies were trying to be responsible, right? So countermeasures, for addressing deepfakes, but then also, as you said, steering people away from them to trusted sources. So in other words, they were making a distinction between those contexts in which truth seeking was what was at issue and were ring fencing that activity in a sense versus other kinds of activities. I'm wondering, Nate, could you say a little bit more just for everybody's sort of information about sort of what you meant by platform countermeasures? Like what were they? How do they work? And then, let's talk about, is this durable? Can we imagine platform companies actually kind of baking in professional norms, industry standards to do these, both the kind of countermeasures and the ring fencing or directing people back to validated sources?
So there's sort of different platforms I'm talking about all at once here. And so let's start with the AI platforms, which of course now some of the social media platforms are also AI platforms. Let's talk about someone like OpenAI or Anthropic, which is when people try to use them as search and they try to get information about the election infrastructure, will this LLM return an answer? And what they tried to build in was, in certain instances, it will not return an answer. It will revert to search, and or it will forward you to the National Association of Secretary of State's websites, Democracy Works, or other kinds of trusted sources. Google will do that as well. One thing that we should admit, and let me put my sort of lawyer's hat on, is that as all of these platforms increasingly use generative AI to produce answers as opposed to refer you out, the Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which generally immunizes them for user-generated content, will not immunize them for responses that they're going to be providing through their AI tools. And so those companies are potentially liable. When I was talking about most of the countermeasures to deal with, say, synthetic media, I'm thinking about like the security teams at Facebook. And so what they end up doing is analyzing the propagation of any content on the network. And so if you see a suspicious number of accounts in a particular formation that are amplifying certain content, whether it's synthetic or otherwise, they have countermeasures, again, AI-informed countermeasures that then lead them to demote or take down those accounts or otherwise react. That's why, they took down 2 Russian organized influence operations, 1 Iranian one, and I think 1 Chinese one in over the election season. And so this is not an AI story, which is to say it's not an AI content generation story, but more about how the sophisticated tools that the platforms have developed can be used to get at that kind of content.
Bruce, do you want to add anything on that subject?
No, I think that's right. I mean, it
Okay.
really is about recognizing, Facebook calls it coordinated and authentic behavior.
Mhm.
And there's no way to do that without technology because there's just too much data flowing into these platforms. And
Mhm.
I see arms races for foreseeable future on all of this.
And let
Great.
me add one other thing on this, something I forgot to say in response to what Bruce said earlier, but is consistent with what he said, which is that there's a lot of effort and money right now being put toward authentication of video and synthetic other kinds of content, right? The C2PA efforts to try to just have content progeny and authenticity. I tend to think that this is very important work that needs to be done both scientifically, but not only is it an arms race for the reasons I think Bruce was saying, but ultimately it's not going to solve the disinformation problem because of the kind of emotive or emotional and tribal nature of information consumption that Bruce was talking about before. That is totally orthogonal to whether you have a watermark on a piece of content or not, right? I think we're not going to get out of this problem that some people are simply not going to trust certain sources, regardless of how much watermarking there is on it.
The other way to say that is those who would believe a watermark don't need a watermark, and those who need a watermark won't believe the watermark.
Yeah, no, fair enough. All right, so this seems like the core of the issue. We've got basically an arms race between coordinated inauthentic behavior and coordinated authentic behavior. Or sometimes that coordinated inauthentic behavior is coordinated malicious behavior, right? So, but that's the arms race. As you said, these tools can, they power the good and the bad to do more of in a more powerful way what they're doing before. But let's come to the coordinated authentic behavior, the positive uses that Bruce was talking about. As I heard you walk through those examples, Bruce, I was struck by the way in which AI tools are helping people break through two limits, the limit of time and the limit of complexity. So the candidate who ran in Japan and could answer all of those, questions to potential voters with an avatar is breaking through a time bound. The example of the organization that is helping people run for nonpartisan offices by helping them know how to file, how to get a website set up, how to do all the mechanics of running for office, and sort of breaking through the problem of complexity for people. Is that a reasonable way of describing, the kind of way in which tools can capacitate people for that authentic political coordination?
So I actually have 4 different axes: speed, scale, scope, and sophistication.
Okay, fill
You
us
can help
in.
in any one of those things.
Okay.
And you're right. I mean, certainly speed is obvious when we're talking about chatbots or propaganda. It's speed. Sophistication, I was thinking about polling, about get out the vote campaigns, canvassing. That is a sophistication mechanism. Scope, you're going to see systems that can deal with a wide variety of platforms. And scale, of course, now we can have 1,000, a
Mhm.
million fake chatbots or Latanya Sweeney calls persona bots.
Mhm.
So yes, I mean, and it doesn't have to be better in everything, right? If you can't afford a human campaign manager, which if you're running for Congress, you can, but for the gazillion local offices, you can't. And your
Right.
position when you win is probably unpaid. So in
Mhm.
all of these offices, an AI that will assist you in running for office is huge. Right?
Yep,
So yes,
absolutely. So there's one question. I'm going to switch over to questions from Q&A now. So folks, do get your questions in. I want to start with one which is exactly about this, the positive uses. This is from Hilary Lair, co-founder and CEO of Quiller.ai. And she says they launched the first fine-tuned
I'm a fan
model.
of Quiller AI.
Okay, so you know about Quiller.
I
So that
do.
just so that everybody else who hasn't read this yet knows, they designed content generation for campaigns and nonprofits, worked with Senator-elect Adam Schiff, Everytown for Gun Safety, and down ballot candidates. But in the trenches, they notice that there's a real fear of blowback, that good actors using the tools responsibly were sort of not trusted, even with human in the loop and other best practices. So how can we appropriately discuss real risks and issues without thwarting responsible use and better adoption for healthy use cases? What should we do?
I think we need to talk about the positive use cases. I mean, in a lot of the things that Hillary's talking about, an AI is being an assistant. Now, we have human assistants and they make mistakes and we know how to deal with them. And my guess is that future campaigns will have human assistants, AI assistants, and the human in charge will sort through the various pieces of advice. I mean, I think there is a lot of fear mongering. And you're right. If I was running for office, I might worry about a news report that says, I have an AI, campaign expert. But these are positive uses, and using AI to help craft fundraising emails or constituent emails or write speeches. But when the president makes a speech, he didn't write it. Like when you get a Christmas card signed by him, he didn't sign it. I mean, this use of a complex socio-technical system supporting the single human who is the face of the candidate, that's been the world for decades. And this is not changing that. But you're right that there is this perception that we're going to have to overcome.
But I also
Right.
don't think that it's like really important for us to um, demonstrate how good AI is for these kind of tactics. It's going to be part of our everyday lives. So it's going to be, if everybody's writing emails using AI, the fact that a campaign is using AI to write emails is going to be a non-event. And so I would be concerned about these firms that are positioning themselves as simply like AI for campaigns. It's like they should be, just making campaigns better, making them cheaper, using the scale and the speed and all those kinds of things that Bruce was talking about. And of course, they're going to use the most relevant and contemporary technology to do that. And so I think that I mean, this is true. Like, take my other life that I work in, and you can see behind me here the Palm Beach butterfly ballot machine that I have in my office. Um, you know,
We have
anytime
one in our office too.
anytime you integrate tech into elections, people justifiably get concerned, and so we've, if anything, been moving away from the most sophisticated tech, let's say, in voting, and like a move toward internet voting is appropriately raising concerns. Nevertheless, you're going to see election officials using AI to do all kinds of things, whether it's to validate signatures on mail ballots, or whether it's to engage in voter outreach, whether it's to place polling places. It's because it's going to be part of all the digital tools that we use. And so I almost want to allow the seeping in of AI into these different procedures without us ringing the bell that, hey, it's AI that's doing it.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think that's really important. I mean, yes, it's, like electricity, right? Electricity
Yeah,
is in
right.
everything. And AI really is like
But
that.
that was once scary.
Right. Yes, exactly.
Right?
Yeah, hence the comparison. So at the same time, though, so here's the kind of the thing where I think it gets hard. Yes, AI will be in everything, will be in every aspect of our elections in the same way that electricity is. Um, and at the same time, there will be some things that choices people might make, modes of behavior that come organically out of the development of new capacities and the like, but when they aggregate and sort of taken at a macro level, may fundamentally change some of the dynamics of how political systems operate. And I think we have a very hard time anticipating what some of those systemic sort of causes or consequences might be. But I do think some of our worries come out of that. So for example, I want to bring in another question from the Q&A here. So somebody, Paul, writes and says that there was a recent Channel 4 documentary in the UK that demonstrated how AI-generated fake content could influence swing voters to support either Labour or Conservative parties, with a significant majority voting as intended by the documentarians. What systems or methods can be implemented to identify AI-generated fakes in political content, perhaps similar to how explicit lyrics are labeled in music. Now, I want to acknowledge that this is no different from what propaganda or persuasion has always done, right? That is the point of political persuasion, is to bring undecided voters over. And so the fact that people are being brought over via an AI based tool is not necessarily different than the fact that they're being brought over by any other communications medium. So I think the question, though, that's here is, to what degree does it matter for people to understand what the sources of persuasion are? How stable does that need to be for a healthy information ecosystem? And so this is coming back to the water. I know you already both had a comment on the watermarking issue, but nonetheless, I think it's a persistent question, and so it's worth addressing. But then secondly, and this is where I think the arms race sort of question always comes up. So yes, the tools enable the good and the bad. But do they enable good and bad equally? I think, how on earth do we know whether or not they enable good and bad equally?
I think we don't. Right? I mean, we're talking about is the second order effects of AI, and we can predict the first order effects. Second order effects are hard. Third order
Right.
effects are even harder.
Yep.
Right? AI has certain, like all technology, AI has certain affordances, makes things easier or hard. I am not optimistic in watermarking. So you mentioned like music. I can do images. That's pretty easy. I can't do text. There's not enough noise in it. Like I can do sound, I can do images, I can't do text watermarking. And it's hard to make watermarks robust. There was a paper by Google last month about putting watermarks in text. It's not going to last. You make enough edits and the watermark is gone. But I don't know if it matters. I mean, if I'm concerned about fake ads, I don't care whether they're made by AI or actors on a soundstage. So something you said, Danielle, I think early on, that it's not AI, but AI can be a catalyst for changes in democracy to make democracy better. Right? So I don't care about fake AI ads. I care about fake ads. I care about truth. I care about all these things. And if AI makes us notice the problem and fix it, that's great. But I don't want a fix to be AI only. I want the fix to be general.
Well, all right. So here's where we might there might be some distance between us. Then I think at this early stage, taking as aggressive a move in the favor of disclosure is a good thing. That we want to have as much sort of disclosure, say in political ads of when AI is being used, that won't last over time. But I think also the fact that the AI companies, OpenAI and Anthropic, had rules against using their tools for political campaigning this time, which is something we haven't talked about. I thought that was smart as well, because we just don't know what how these tools are going to be used, and I don't think, again, that's going to be sustained over time, but I think that we need to be very careful at these early stages. um, of course, Bruce is right, which is that whether it's through Photoshop or whether it's through Dolly, if you create an image that is fake, it could have the same impact. But there's something about we tend to forget that artificial intelligence is artificial, right? And so that the point about disclosure with respect to AI is that we are quickly going to be living in a world where it's going to be very difficult for us to distinguish as to who we're in there, whether we're interacting with a computer or whether we're interacting with a human being, right? And so the more as the technology gets rolled out, for us to have as much disclosure as possible is, I think, a good thing. Recognizing the problems with respect to watermarking and how these disclosures are not always going to work. But there are always going to be responsible media organizations that are going to want to know whether you can kind of trace the progeny of an image or not. And I think it's important for us to invest in that, recognizing that there are going to be drawbacks over the medium term.
So again, I don't think it's AI. So I was in France recently and I was watching television, and it's an advertisement for a hair care product. And on the TV, on the ad, it says in French that the model has hair extensions, simulated hair. It's not AI, but it's a disclosure. Again, whether it's AI created hair or whether it's hair extensions, it's the same deception.
No,
So
I
I
agree with
want
that.
this
The
rule to be
problem is that,
general.
like AI, uh, that it's going to be, we're not going to be able to prohibit lying, right? Or have
But you can
disclaimers.
require advertiser to say model has simulated hair. You can do
True.
that.
And
France
that will
did
deal
it.
with hair commercials, right?
These are all going to be specific. You're right.
No, but the point is a generalized disclaimer, let's say for political ads, that you have to disclose when an image is AI generated. It's not going to deal with most of the lies in politics, to be sure, but at least it will deal with the technological enhancement due to AI, and that's, again, not going to solve a disinformation problem, but it will deal with the panic related to AI.
Let me go ahead and turn this in a different direction. I'm going to go back to where we were at the very beginning of the conversation when you were talking about uses of AI for polling. There are a couple of questions that are connected here that I think open up the question of, at what point do AI tools in fact offer us alternatives to even, say, elections, right? I mean, that's kind of a place where a question might get. So, for example, one person says, a Canadian company is using AI to do polling, not by asking questions, but by tracking voter comments and connections. They claim to be able to monitor opinions of voters in real time and monitor the changing opinions of the same voter cohorts continuously. This seems to have done a much better job in predicting election outcomes. So that's question one. And then question two, let's see. Bruce, you've discussed the lossy bottleneck in representative democracy, where citizens must compress their complex policy preferences into choosing just one or two candidates. With AI now enabling more nuanced political engagement, could we be moving toward a system where technology allows for more direct and granular expression of citizen preferences? So that's really the question. Like, if technology can give us a better picture of citizen preferences, what does that mean for
And so it's
elections?
this. So the first questioner, that's called social listening, and that's older than AI. This, can we figure out what people think in ways other than asking? And the problem with asking is, one, nobody picks up the phone when you call them, and two, they lie when you ask them questions. And there's a lot of mathematics in polling to deal with both of those problems. Uh, it was called math. Now it's called AI. It's a lot of the same stuff. I mean, there's good and bad here, and we see that when we see polls that don't work. We're doing our best with polling, but it's being increasingly black art that doesn't really work. So AI will be a part of that, and I think there's gonna be a lot of techniques which will merge asking actual people and doing a bunch of complex math. And then the question is, can we get beyond voting? And it's really interesting, right? I as a voter, have a complex series of things I want and believe and preferences. And the policy space is equally complex and rich. And when I got to vote, I got to vote one of two people. And so it gets contracted down and expanded up. And that's kind of dumb. So I think about AI, I read this in the book I'm writing, to facilitate more citizen ballot initiatives that you can do 50 or 100 if an AI can help you figure out how to vote. And maybe that's a good idea. I worry a lot about AI voting for you, either directly or indirectly giving you, here's who you should vote for. Because democracy is more than getting the right outcome. It is the process of getting the right outcome. And replacing the messy human process with the AI just said this, which really is the premise of this new book. Like, let the AI decide. Even if it produces a better outcome, I don't think it's better for society. So I'm very much against let the AI figure it out. That the human process is an independent good than the result.
Thank you,
I would,
Bruce.
I would add
Nate?
just one word at the to put a pin in what Bruce was just saying, which is legitimacy, right? So you can't think of democratic legitimacy apart from human beings. So that if you think that in part you're talking about consent of the governed here when you're talking about decisions that are being made in elections and in democracy generally. The fact that you would outsource to AI, right, there may be some utilitarian argument in order to do it, but in terms of legitimacy of the process, I don't think you can find it. I'll say on the polls, that's where I hold out some hope, which is that because the polling industry has been on its back foot for a decade now, that you can think of ways of measuring public sentiment that using AI over time. If I had a profit-seeking bone in my body, I would develop a company that would get a large panel of, let's say, 10,000 people in the U.S. to hand over their social media feeds, interview them every so often, and essentially create a 10,000 virtual person panel where you could continually interrogate those AI agents to figure out, where sentiment is going. And so
There's a
I'm
company
sure.
doing that.
Yeah, I mean, it makes a lot of sense. And my colleague Rob Willer here has shown that using certain techniques that you can do really good and reliable experiments on AI that are validated when you do it to real people.
And that's the trick, validating it with real people.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's the critical piece. So last question for both of you. We'll close with this. As you've been watching this conversation evolve over the last 18 months. What are the questions that you think are the hardest, most interesting questions now that you'd like other people to help you with when you think about the relationship between AI and the electoral process? What should people be doing research on?
I think a lot about AI and power. And really the central question here is whether AI is democratizing, whether it empowers broadly, or whether it makes the already powerful even more powerful. And to the extent that it's broad, it services democracy. To the extent that it is further creates power imbalances, it's not serving democracy. And that connection, I think, is something we don't talk about enough. We talk about accuracy, we talk about bias, talk about information. We really need to talk about power. And the word Nate used is legitimacy. I would say trust, I mean, more broadly, that these systems are going to be positions of trust. And whether it is something as simple as producing a poll or giving candidate advice or helping write legislation or being a trade negotiating assistant or being a judicial assistant or a lawyer assistant, there are different types of trust that matter here. So I think those are really interesting. Actually, I want to close with one thing I forgot from my opening statement. The weirdest use of AI in the election cycle was a mayoral candidate from Wyoming who basically said, "Oh, vote for me and we'll do what the AI did." He would carry a speak box on his chest. I'm not making this up. He'd go to press conferences. People would ask him a question, and the AI would listen, and the AI would respond. So the humans running for office with the promise was, I'm going to do whatever the AI says. He didn't win, thank heavens, but that kind of thing's coming.
Thank you for that nice moment of levity, Bruce. Nate, how about you? What are the hardest questions? What should people be researching?
So I'm spending a lot of my time these days thinking about regulation of AI and also, but both self-regulation by the companies and then also by by governments. For those who are interested, we have this new book called The Digitalist Papers that Condi Rice, Eric Brynjolfsson, Sandy Pentland, and I have put out as an edited volume. Um, So I actually think one of the most important questions that policymakers need to deal with, and this has democracy implications as well, is how we're gonna think about the AI ecosystem with respect to open models, sometimes called open source models, and closed models. It's kind of a wonky thing to talk about in this context, but we need to make a decision as a world about whether we are going to join arms and jump off the cliff and allow for these very powerful tools to be available to the widest population. There are good arguments for doing so, both from a cybersecurity perspective as well as a digital divide perspective, especially since all the major AI companies are basically in the West and principally, about 50 miles from where I'm sitting right now. And so there is a risk that we go, as some of the questioners in the Q&A point out, that we just have a few companies that are governing the world of AI, but these open models, they carry significant risks, but they also can carry significant promise when it comes to the democratization of AI. Last thing I would say, and this is a little bit of a modification of what I said earlier, which is that it is going to be increasingly difficult to figure out how much AI makes something AI. And so take something like imagery. Most cameras right now, even when you think it's taking like a picture, an accurate picture of the reality in front of you, is actually using AI to then construct the image. And so there's almost becoming an existential question as to how are we going to be able to define what is real versus what is artificially generated as these tools become so ubiquitous in our lives.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for a really wonderful conversation. I appreciate your taking the time to join us again. And I wish everybody well. And I appreciate particularly the questions that were about the positive uses of AI. I think, Bruce, your question about power will depend on whether or not those of us who care about democracy, care about that human process, as you so eloquently described it, actually do the work to harness this technology to support that goal. So I think the power question can't be answered in advance. It will be answered by whether or not, again, those of us who care about democracy and human empowerment do the work we need to do to make sure these tools are deployed for that purpose.